Well, I was a student in environmental sciences in an agricultural college in the 1970s. At some point, the Philips company started marketing automatic measuring instruments for SO2. They talked the Dutch government into establishing a network of no less than 200 monitoring stations in this very small country. And with a group of students, we made an analysis of that network and found out that the Dutch Health Council had established a standard for SO2, partly to make sense of all these monitoring data. So that was sort of an eye-opener for me that the relationship between air pollution and health was becoming prominent. And briefly after that, I did a master's thesis on air pollution health standard setting, which covered all of these issues of epidemiology, human experiments, toxicology, but also the policy aspects of standard setting and the like. So from then on, which is the mid-1970s, I've always been interested in environment and health. And then they appointed a new professor of environment and health in my college, and I started working with him, and he gave me my first job in what was it, 1979 or so, and the rest is history. He was also always very close to policy issues. So that's one thing I learned from him, that this science of environmental epi we don't do in isolation, but it's always related to policy questions, because we don't study these questions in isolation, but we either look at environmental health issues because there is concern in the population about some clusters of health effects that people think are related to the environment. So in the 1980s, nobody in Europe was too much interested in air pollution and health, because the feeling was that with the measures taken in the 60s and 70s, pollution levels had become so low that it was no longer a public health concern. So there was much more concern about, for example, in Germany, about decaying woods because of air pollution. And this changed gradually in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when new studies were making clear that there is something going on with health effects of air pollution also below the levels that were previously considered to be safe. At the same time, the European Union was establishing international cooperations in many fields, including environmental health and air pollution health. And one of the early collaborations was a so-called cost action on air pollution epidemiology. That was not a research project, but it was an activity to bring people from Europe together to talk about the issues, what needs to be done about air pollution epidemiology. And this is about 1990. And that particular cost action produced many of the collaborations that I and others have been involved in Europe. For example, the peace study on asthmatic children in Europe that we did in the early to mid 1990s came out of that. The AFIA studies coordinated by Claire Katsiani from Greece is another example, and there were many more studies that gradually came out of those European collaborations. And what was important, I think, at the European level is that you could only get grants if there was international collaboration of at least 3 different countries. So the EU was forcing you to collaborate rather than to compete. And this has always been a very good aspect compared to the US, for example, where there's much more competition between institutes and less collaboration. Well, initially, I was very interested in indoor air pollution. We had just come out of the energy crisis of the 1970s. So our government was doing a big campaign to make people isolate their homes. There's nothing new, we still do that, but this was the early 1980s. And with some colleagues, we were worried that if you seal your home too well, you may aggravate indoor air pollution problems, because there's lots of indoor sources of air pollution. In the early 1980s, nobody was too worried about environmental tobacco smoke, for example. That only came later in the 1980s. So we started a program on indoor air pollution rather than outdoor air pollution, because there wasn't much interest in financing to be obtained for outdoor air pollution. That kept me busy for most of the 1980s, I guess. Yeah, I met Jörn, I think, 30 years ago or so for the first time. And we've been collaborating also on 2 birth cohorts, the Bamse cohort in Sweden and the Pyjama birth cohort that we organized in the Netherlands. We've had collaboration since the mid-1990s between our 2 groups. It's always been very, pleasant and productive. I think it was positively influenced in many ways. I did a sabbatical in 1986, 1987 with the Harvard School of Public Health, where the 6-city study was going on at the time.
Yeah.
So I worked closely with Doug Dockery, Jim Ware, Frank Spitzer, Ben Ferris, Jack Spengler, and all those, greats of the 1980s and later. So that helped me a lot to get to know a lot of important people on the other side of the ocean, working on air pollution and health. Yeah, the first international meeting was 1989, and I was there. And I was interested for a while already in environmental epidemiology. I did my PhD thesis on environmental lead and blood lead in children, based on some large population studies in the Netherlands. So there is a long history of this field, well before ISEE, and I was interested in that from the very beginning. So, and I saw this announcement for the first meeting in '89. I immediately signed up, and I think there were about 120 or 150 people there. So it's really small. Yeah, we've been up to 1,500. We had 1,500 in Utrecht, the last face-to-face meeting in 2019. It's become a lot bigger over the years. And what I find especially interesting is that it apparently has been so attractive to young people, young scientists to join. So this has been apparent for the last 15 years at least, that, each time you would get to the meeting and you would see a lot of new fresh faces from all over the world. I think ISEE has done a great job in attracting new young scholars to the society who have also taken up leadership roles and been very important in committees and all sorts of activities of ISEE. So I find it really rewarding to see. Society was a lot smaller then. It existed for essentially 10 years, something like 10 years at the time. And I was, work-wise, I was going through a move from one university to another with my whole department, because a year after the elections, my university decided to abolish my department. This is not just me, but 30 or 35 other people who were threatened with losing their jobs. And we spent a lot of effort to move the whole department to the Utrecht University, where we still are. So for a while, I considered handing back the presidency of ISEE because so much else was going on. In the end, I didn't, and I was glad I didn't. But I think I was sidetracked every once in a while by the other things that were going on. So I may not have spent as much time as I would have liked to on the presidency. If I would describe my own role at that time, I think it was, making sure the regular business of the society went on, that meeting sites for future meetings were established, that the finances were in order, that the awards were being handed out to the right persons, and all these other things that make that are part of the day-to-day running of the society. Well, people like Gerard Hoek and Ulrike Gering have served as counselors, and they were co-organizers at the 2019 meeting with me. So they are just among several people from my group who have taken on an active role in ISEE. And, apart from the presidency, I was the main organizer of the 95 conference, as I mentioned. I was a counselor for a couple of years in the 1990s. I forget which years exactly. Been on various committees for ISEE. So through the years, I've always been involved and active. And as I mentioned, I went to most of the meetings, with the exception of 4 or 5 over the years. So I've always been closely involved with society and felt part of it from whenever it started in 1989. ISEE meetings became the major meetings where new developments in air pollution epidemiology were discussed. Before ISEE, we would typically go to the American Thoracic Society meetings. We would typically go to the European Respiratory Society meetings, because that's where most of the air pollution epidemiology was being presented. But ISEE quickly changed that. If you look at the programs of ATS and ERS at the moment, there is still some air pollution work, but it's much less prominent than it was in the 1980s. And ISEE has essentially taken over that and has become much more focused meetings with respect to air pollution epidemiology, and of course all sorts of other environmental health issues. So the ISEE meetings were actually the place to be if you wanted to, talk and gossip with your friends and colleagues about the newest developments, and also, talk about the more personal issues, the sensitive issues related to policy and private developments and everything. So that has been very important ever since ISEE was started for me, and I'm sure for many other people in the field, to have this opportunity to meet, in each and every meeting, at least 50% of the who is who in air pollution epidemiology in the world. You can't underestimate the importance of that for the field and for the development of the careers of many of us.